January 1945. Northern Europe was locked in winter, the kind of cold that seeped through walls and settled into bones. Inside a British command headquarters, the lights were low, the air heavy with cigarette smoke and damp wool. Outside, the guns of the Battle of the Bulge were still echoing across frozen forests. Inside, the war was about to shift in a far more dangerous direction. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery sat alone. No odds, no staff officers, no maps spread across the table. In front of him was a typewriter. The steady clack of keys cut through the silence. Each word landed with precision, not like a battlefield order, but like a blade. This was not a plan to destroy German divisions. It was something far more reckless. A message aimed inward, at allies, at the very structure holding the war together. One message, one insult, and the Allied alliance would come closer to collapse than it ever had under enemy fire. Montgomery believed he was writing history. In reality, he was lighting a fuse. The document taking shape on that typewriter was a secret message, never meant for American eyes. It was addressed to the British High Command in London, bypassing the normal chain of command entirely. Not Eisenhower, not the Allied staff, straight to Britain's highest military authorities. That alone made it dangerous. Coalition warfare survives on discipline and discretion. Montgomery violated both. In his message, he did not merely criticize strategy. He attacked competence. He described the American command structure as chaotic, directionless, barely holding together. Worse, he turned his judgment on the men fighting in the snow. He called American soldiers brave but ineffective, courageous but useless without proper leadership. It was a carefully chosen insult, polite on the surface, devastating underneath. Montgomery believed the Americans were winning the war with numbers, not skill, that they were reckless, aggressive, and strategically immature. In his mind, the crisis unfolding in the Ardennes was proof that the Americans had been given too much responsibility too soon. And he believed this message would remain hidden, protected by rank, protected by prestige, protected by the assumption that Britain still held moral authority over the alliance. He was wrong, because this message was not just criticism. It was a political maneuver, an attempt to reshape the command structure of the largest coalition war in history. And Montgomery wrote it with the confidence of a man who believed power still flowed through London. But by January 1945, power had already shifted. The alliance between the United States and Britain was often described as special. In reality, it was a forced marriage. Two partners bound together by necessity, not affection. They smiled for the cameras, shook hands for the newsreels, and privately resented each other more than they admitted. The only thing holding them together was Adolf Hitler. At the center stood Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander. Not a tactical genius, not a battlefield virtuoso. Eisenhower's real skill was emotional endurance. He managed egos the size of armies. He negotiated disputes, soothed pride, and absorbed insults in silence, all to keep the machine running. He understood something Montgomery did not. This war was not about brilliance. It was about balance. Montgomery came from a different world. The British imperial tradition, carefully planned battles, hierarchy, deference to rank and experience. He had defeated Rommel. He had earned fame, and he believed that victory entitled him to authority. To Montgomery, Eisenhower was a coordinator, a facilitator, a pleasant American who should handle politics and logistics while real soldiers made real decisions. The resentment had been building for months, hidden behind formal smiles and polite briefings. By winter 1944, it was no longer hidden. The spark came in the Ardennes. In December 1944, German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. They struck where the Allied lines were thin, where American units were resting and refitting. The front collapsed with shocking speed. Roads clogged with retreating units. Communications failed. Entire divisions were cut off. To the world, it looked like disaster. To Montgomery, it looked like vindication. From his headquarters in the north, He watched reports flood in. Confusion, panic, isolated American units surrounded by German armor. In his mind, this was not tragedy. It was evidence. Proof that his warnings had been ignored. Proof that American command was fundamentally flawed. He did not see exhausted soldiers fighting in impossible conditions. He saw amateurs exposed. The "I told you so" settled in quickly. Montgomery convinced himself that the American army was on the verge of collapse. That only firm British discipline could restore order. That the war itself depended on his intervention. This belief hardened into something more dangerous, a savior complex. He did not see himself as helping allies. He saw himself as rescuing incompetence. And in that moment, as American soldiers bled in the snow, Montgomery began calculating something far more ambitious than victory. He began calculating control. Eisenhower faced a brutal reality. The German offensive had physically split the Allied front. American armies in the north were cut off from their headquarters. Communications were unreliable. Coordination was breaking down. A decision had to be made quickly. In a move driven purely by logistics, Eisenhower temporarily transferred operational control of 2 American armies to Montgomery's command. It was meant to be a stopgap, a practical solution to a battlefield problem. On paper, it was temporary. In reality, it was enormous. Overnight, Montgomery gained authority over hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, along with vast armored and logistical resources. It was one of the largest transfers of power between Allied commanders in the war. Montgomery did not treat it as a loan. He treated it as confirmation. He slowed operations, insisting on perfect positioning while American units fought desperately to hold ground. He reorganized command structures, imposed his methods, and sidelined American urgency in favor of British caution. To him, this was professionalism. To the Americans, it felt like paralysis. Meanwhile, Bastogne was under siege. American paratroopers were surrounded, low on supplies, holding out against repeated German attacks. Every hour mattered. Montgomery hesitated. And as he exercised his new authority, the secret message he had already sent to London quietly moved through British channels, carrying words that could not be taken back. By the end of January 1945, Montgomery held power, prestige, and influence over American armies. He also carried an insult powerful enough to shatter the alliance. And the people he had underestimated were about to read it. The message did not explode immediately. That was the most dangerous part. It traveled quietly, carried across secure lines, sealed in formal language and institutional trust. When it reached London, it landed on desks occupied by men who understood exactly what it meant. British military leaders read Montgomery's words in silence. Some leaned back in their chairs. Others reread the lines, hoping they had misunderstood. This was not frustration. This was not a moment of battlefield anger. This was a calculated judgment passed on the very ally paying for the war. The Americans were supplying the bulk of the troops, the tanks, the fuel, the food, the aircraft, the money, and one of Britain's most famous generals had just called their soldiers brave but ineffective. The danger was obvious. If this message ever escaped the private world of cables and memoranda, it would not cause embarrassment. It would cause rupture. The alliance was stretched thin already. Britain was exhausted, economically hollowed out by years of war. America was powerful, impatient, and increasingly aware of its leverage. Everything depended on trust. And Montgomery had just cracked it. The secret message was a private betrayal, the press conference was a public one. In early January 1945, Montgomery stood before reporters and spoke confidently about the Battle of the Bulge. His tone was calm, assured, self-satisfied. He framed the crisis not as a desperate stand by American troops, but as a situation brought under control by his leadership. Again and again he spoke about what he had done, how his decisions had stabilized the front, how his careful planning had prevented disaster. The word "I" echoed through the room. The Americans were mentioned only in passing. There was no emphasis on the scale of their losses. No recognition of the thousands of American soldiers who had held the line against German armor in freezing conditions. No acknowledgement of units surrounded, undersupplied, and fighting on regardless. Quietly, the facts told a different story. American casualties numbered in the tens of thousands. Entire divisions had absorbed the shock of the German offensive. British forces, by comparison, had been engaged far more lightly. But facts do not matter in the moment of humiliation. When transcripts of Montgomery's words reached American headquarters, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Officers who had fought alongside British units felt publicly diminished. Commanders who had buried their men felt erased. This was no longer strategy. This was insult. And it landed like a slap. Dwight Eisenhower received the transcripts and the secret message within days of each other. For months, he had absorbed tension quietly. He had compromised, smoothed egos, deflected blame. He had accepted Montgomery's arrogance as the cost of coalition warfare. This time, something broke. Eisenhower did not shout. He did not slam doors or call for aides. He sat at his desk, cigarette smoke curling in the cold air, and read the words again and again. He understood exactly what Montgomery was doing. This was not about winning battles. It was about power. For the first time, Eisenhower considered the unthinkable. He began drafting a message to Washington. Not a complaint, an ultimatum. The language was formal, controlled, deadly. He stated plainly that he could no longer work with Montgomery, that the situation had become untenable. And then he delivered the sentence that changed everything. It is him or me. This was not a bluff. Eisenhower knew the arithmetic of the war. American troops made up the overwhelming majority of Allied manpower in Europe. American factories were producing weapons at a scale Britain could not match. American public opinion mattered. And Eisenhower was trusted in Washington. If he resigned, the alliance would fracture publicly. If Montgomery stayed, the Americans might pull back cooperation. Either outcome favored only one man, Hitler. The message was ready for encryption. The moment it was sent, the alliance would cross a line it could not uncross. Before the cable left Eisenhower's headquarters, word reached London. When Winston Churchill learned of Eisenhower's ultimatum, the weight of reality fell hard. He was a romantic by temperament, a man of speeches and symbols. But he was also a survivor. He understood power when he saw it. Britain was no longer the senior partner. Its empire was drained. Its economy fragile. Its military dependent on American production. If Eisenhower walked away, Britain would not simply lose influence. It would lose the war's political future. The United States would finish the war without deference, and the post-war world would be shaped accordingly. Churchill understood something Montgomery never had. This was not about pride. This was about survival. He moved quickly. Gone was indulgence. Gone was admiration. Montgomery's victories no longer mattered. What mattered was preventing disaster. Churchill's message to Montgomery was not eloquent. It was blunt, almost cruel. He made it clear that Eisenhower held all the leverage, that Britain could not afford a rupture, that Montgomery's position was no longer protected by reputation. Apologize, fully, publicly, immediately, or your career ends here. Churchill did not argue tactics. He argued reality. Britain was now the junior partner. The Americans were not guests. They were the owners of the enterprise. And insulting the men who supplied the war was unforgivable. In that moment, Churchill became the only adult in the room, the man willing to crush ego to save the alliance. Montgomery received the message and finally understood. The arrogance drained away. The confidence evaporated. For the first time, he saw himself not as indispensable, but as expendable. The great field marshal reduced to a liability. That night he sat alone again, not triumphant this time, not calculating, writing a letter he never imagined he would have to write. The apology was careful, measured, painful. He praised the bravery of American soldiers, acknowledged their sacrifice, expressed regret for any misunderstanding. And then came the line that mattered most. He signed it as Eisenhower's subordinate. When Eisenhower read the letter, he did not celebrate. He did not respond emotionally. He took the draft of his resignation, crumpled it, and discarded it. His reply was brief, professional. The crisis was over. But nothing was the same. Montgomery kept his rank. He kept his command. What he lost was influence. From that point forward, the strategic direction of the war shifted decisively. American commanders gained greater autonomy. Broad front advances replaced cautious set-piece battles. Speed replaced deliberation. When the Allies crossed into Germany, American armies surged forward in numbers that dwarfed anything Britain could field. The reality Churchill had described became visible to everyone. The war's final phase belonged to America. Montgomery would continue to fight, continue to command, but his voice no longer carried the weight it once had. The alliance had survived, but the hierarchy within it had been permanently rewritten. History often remembers battles. It remembers maps, movements, and victories. What it forgets is how close alliances come to destroying themselves without firing a shot. Montgomery believed words were harmless, that prestige protected him, that the Americans needed him more than he needed them. History proved otherwise. Churchill understood what Montgomery did not. In coalition warfare, words can be weapons, sometimes more dangerous than bullets. One message, sent in confidence, nearly shattered the most powerful alliance in history. The Americans were called useless. They went on to carry the war to its end. And the alliance survived not because its leaders liked each other, but because one man knew when to stop the damage, and another was forced to listen. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden power struggles of World War II, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories history prefers to soften. Let us know in the comments whose side you were on, Montgomery or Eisenhower. And stay tuned. The next story involves another secret conflict, another buried message, and another moment when the war nearly broke itself from the inside.